Hey guys, welcome to The Bottom Half is Red. I'm your host, Baron Longstrath, and I am excited to bring to you a show that is going to give you some thought-provoking discussions. It's going to give you some expert insights to both encourage and some practical steps for how to build an organization that can more effectively introduce the world to Jesus Christ. So what is The Bottom Half is Red? It's all about building a culture of excellence. It's about growing your unique and creative identity. And it's about carrying out the will of God at any cost. So you're going to see that through practical teaching tips, developing a culture of giving, creating branding and marketing, or even methods to help guests feel safe and welcomed. This podcast is going to have you covered. But before we dive into today's episode, I want to take just a moment and extend a special invitation to all of our dedicated listeners. If you're looking to get even more involved in our community and gain some access to some behind-the-scenes stuff, become a Patreon supporter. And you can find that link in the episode description or even on Patreon. Just visit The Bottom Half is Red. Listen, we can't wait to welcome you on board and to share this exciting journey. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Well, welcome back to The Bottom Half is Red. This is season 2, and I have with me our great executive producer, Dave Tanderup. And if you don't know who he is a vital part of the church today, served a few tours. Am I right with that? A few tours? One tour? 1.5?
I mean, the band never really took off, so it was kind of a one-hit wonder type thing.
That's all right. That's all right. But he's a military man, a very talented individual. He is the one that does all of our executive producing here, so that means he does all the editing, helps us out with the right questions to ask as a content manager. So we have him very busy here, especially within the Bottom Half is Red venue. Dave is highly involved, and his family's highly involved. His daughter is just a phenomenal Bible quizzer, put the beat down on the pastoral team almost single-handedly. Well, the help of your wife, which was unfair, by the way. I'm still a little bit upset about that.
Little bitter
about that. This is our second take, for those that might not know, on this episode. We had a malfunction with technology, and by the way, if you want to hear kind of the behind the scenes, you might want to tag into our Patreon. That's a shameless plug.
Shameless.
Yeah, but I think worth it. And so if you don't know what Patreon is, please, visit one of our social medias, and you'll see that you can become a supporter of it. It gives great access behind the scenes. I think you would enjoy it, especially if you like The Bottom Half is Red. But we're going to talk about a subject that really kind of focuses on some of the why of the church. And the title is Neighbors Matter. Obviously, the term matter here at the church today is incredibly important. You've heard the last season. If you were able to listen, we had a couple episodes that hinged around a fundamental part of our personality, and that's, hey, you matter. And so the term matter, it's a buzz term. I see it, billboards, you see it everywhere. Media uses it for various reasons. So, and it's an important term. And so what we want to do is really try our best in the few minutes that we do have is to define a concept of why neighbors matter. And we're going to be talking today back and forth. On the first take, Dave was throwing out some incredible stuff, and I'm going to lean into him to do the same thing on this episode. But we'd like to take your attention right off the bat to Luke chapter 10. Here's the passage of Scripture. It says, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he said to him, 'What is written in the law?'" This is the discussion between the lawyer and Jesus. "What is your reading of it?" So he answered, this is talking about the lawyer, and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength, and all of your mind." And here's the follow-up. He says, "And your neighbor as yourself." As if it is not difficult enough to love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. In fact, I would just plug that in there right off the bat and say, I think it is impossible without God first revealing or flowing. Let me ask you a question, Dave. The question that I would ask is, especially looking in culture today, division is on the rise.
Yeah.
Right? So you don't have to look far. You can look on your social media. You can look to any media outlet. there is a constant barrage to, it seems to me, like keep division among us. Okay. With that, looking into division, how important would me knowing who my neighbor was really be? Is that a fair question?
Absolutely. And if you're taking the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's easy to say, oh, my neighbor is somebody who's close to me, somebody who lives near me, somebody, you could say a neighbor lives geographically close to me.
Right.
But I could also say that my neighbor lives politically, socially, spiritually close to me. But when Jesus tells this story, he kind of flips that on its head. And yes, your neighbor is those people, but your neighbor is also the people that are on the other side of the divide. Your neighbor is also the person that is politically, socially, morally opposed to you. They're whatever side that you're in, they're the man or woman in the Oval Office that you don't agree with. And it doesn't matter. Jesus says that we still have to love them.
And not only to love them, but Old Testament law is to love them the way that you love your own self.
Yes.
So let's look at that, because the question the lawyer asks, at least the way that Jesus gives the parable, his answer to the parable is, this is not about somebody else.
Yeah.
This really is a question about yourself. And so we need to ask the question of not necessarily who is my neighbor, but am I a neighbor? How am I a neighbor? How am I neighborly? And so, yes, the proximity factor is one key, but the fact of the matter is that we are supposed to be everyone's neighbor.
Yeah.
And we could end the podcast right now and say, think on these things, right? You are supposed to be everyone's neighbor. Why neighbors matter is because I matter to them. They have to matter, but I matter to them no matter what. So when we're talking about neighbors mattering, we're not necessarily saying, hey, everyone around us matters, which 100%. Really what we're saying is, how much do I matter to them? How much should I matter to them? How much should I be neighborly to them? Do we realize how difficult it is to love with heart, soul, mind, and strength? So look at all I have to give God. Do I have anything left? And I know I have to, because the Bible specifically says, and the lawyer answers that. And Jesus he doesn't argue. He doesn't try to split hairs. He just says, well, you're right. Do it and you'll live.
Yeah.
And so now the point of pride comes in and says, well, if I have to love the Lord in this manner, then tell me who else I need to love. So how far out do I have to reach? And that is the essence of what this podcast today is about.
Yeah. Where
does my reach stop? The stone in the pond, the ripple effect, how far does the ripple need to go? How far do I have to allow this, my love, to what extent do I need to go? And right here now, we talk about the wisdom of Jesus, but I just sit back and you're just amazed, because he doesn't go into this dissertation. He says, let me tell you a story. Let me bring your attention to a story. And here's the story. The story, and this is what Jesus says. There's a man that's going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the robbers, who stripped him, who beat him, and they departed, leaving him half dead. There's your neighbor. That's what he says. When he begins, there's a man that was going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, there had to be an absolute defined understanding. Oh my goodness. We know exactly where he's going with this.
Yeah.
Because that road right there is that's a tough road. That road was called the Bloody Pass.
Yeah. It was an 18-mile stretch of road between Jerusalem and Jericho. There were so many places that people could be robbed, murdered, all of this stuff. The Roman soldiers during their occupation didn't even try to police it or do anything like that. And so if you weren't traveling with like an armed security or something like that, you were probably going to run into some trouble.
Yeah. And a necessary path, by the way. It was a necessary road. It was a road of transaction. So there was commerce on that road, and they knew that. So the man obviously had something to take. Jesus specifically says that the man was robbed. So this bloody past Jesus brings right to their attention. So Jesus answers like this. He says, now by chance, a priest going down that same road, when he sees him, he goes to the other side. Same thing with the Levite. He comes to the place, passes by him on the other side. Both of these men are unwilling to get involved. Jesus is setting this man up. He wants the whole story to be laid out. And he brings in a Samaritan, and I know we have a very educated audience, and so we understand that they would have been absolutely hated in this story. And Jesus says, as he journeyed, he came to where he was, and when he saw him, the difference between is, it's immense, but the first reaction is compassion. And we'll go there here in a second. But he goes to him, binds up his wounds, pouring oil and wine, sets him on his own animal, brings him to an inn, takes care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, and he gave it to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I'll repay you when I come back. And so I'm going to take care of this man fully. I'm gonna take care of this man from the time I lay hands on him until he is well enough to be able to maneuver. So who knows the expenses that would be accrued? Okay, clothes, medical, whatever other expenses we're going to handle. The point being is Jesus is specifically making a differentiation between the elite class of how these other 2 men carried themselves.
The people that should have helped, and then somebody who is not only hated and despised, but who had no hope of recovering any of that resource. So whenever that man got better at the inn, there would have been no chance at all that man was going to look for the Samaritan and be like, oh, thanks, here, let me repay you.
Right. No, you're not going back. No, you're not going back. So we don't know the man who is left for dead. We have no idea the background. Obviously, this is a story, but use your imagination.
Yeah.
But we do realize that he is still a part of a system that views the Samaritans as, they're
garbage.
They're absolute garbage. They're worse than Gentiles. In John 4, Jesus visits a Samaritan woman, and the disciples are wondering why they're even in Samaria. And Jesus, the Bible says, must needs, so he's going to Samaria. This is not a matter of chance. This is Jesus particularly walking on the border because he's going to meet her. There's going to be a revival in Samaria, and we don't catch the revival until Philip. So Jesus plants a seed that we don't really see the explosion of until, I believe it's Acts 8, to where Philip goes to Samaria, and now there's a revival, and Peter is there to open the door to that revival. So I must needs go to Samaria. Okay, so I'll ask you a question. How often do you think about, how often do you pray for groups that are what we would call more of across the politically divide? How often do we pray for those? How often do you pray? You don't have to give me a number, but I think the concept is there. Or maybe I should say, how important would it be to say, Jesus, I'm going to pray kingdom prayers. I'm going to allow myself to move in this realm. I'm not going to remain local to my family, to those that I'm comfortable with.
Yeah. I mean, the first answer is not as often as I should, but it does certainly cross my mind about people that aren't in the same place that I am, politically, socially. A lot of my prayers have more to do with helping me to understand that person, because the thing that I've come to realize is that most people are not irrational in their behavior. Your average adult, you could take anybody from any political, social movement spectrum, and the way that they behave, there is a logic to the way that they behave. Now, I may not fundamentally agree with what they're doing at all.
Sure.
But when you sit down and you understand them, you can understand the way that they got to the point that they're at, whether it's gender confusion. And so you can walk back and, okay, why are you the way that you are? I may not agree with what you label yourself or how you label yourself, but when we start walking it back.
Such a good point.
And then I can see where you came from. What this allows me to do is it allows me to find a common ground with that person, because I can't minister to somebody unless I have a point of commonality with them. And so the Good Samaritan, his point of commonality was where that man was laying at that point in time. And so he met the person where he was.
So good.
And I can't meet the person where they are if I don't understand, or if I don't travel the road. Now, I don't have to dive into all the depravities or the whatever it is, to get to logically understand where they are.
That's such a great point, because it's not enough just to see them. It's to see them in their state. The Samaritan would have been the outcast. He would have been the underdog in every story, right? And so Jesus flips the script on this man that says, "Who is my neighbor?" And he's basically saying, you don't need to understand who is your neighbor in terms of proximity, in terms of system or caste or whatever. You need to see yourself as the neighbor. And that's the essence of what we're talking about here today, is not necessarily who qualifies as my responsibility, but rather I have a responsibility to be everyone's neighbor.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. The question the lawyer asks in Jesus' eyes is not necessarily about someone else. It really is a question about himself. You said this man had an issue with pride. And Jesus exposes this pride by saying, I'm going to show you what a neighbor really looks like. If you want to know who is my neighbor, I want to show you what a neighbor really looks like. I particularly like this quote, and the gentleman's last name is Hoffer, and I love the way he says it. He says, "It is easier to love humanity as a whole than to love one's neighbor." It's the concept. And here's the thing that I want to talk about. I'm not talking about the negativity of where we're at as a church. What I'm saying is, let's adjust our mindset to not think in terms of how to love the idea of the world, but to get our hands involved in who is affected by the system of the world. Does that make sense? Or the culture of the world. And so let's not talk about like going into the world and making a difference, or even thinking in terms of like we're going to have worldwide revival. But to the listener out there today, maybe there can be conviction, as I feel conviction, to say, I don't want an idea of, I want to get my hands down into the dirty nitty gritty of where people are at right now. So who is my neighbor is an idea. Set the parameters, right? Draw a circle around me. Do I have to go into Judea? Do I have to go into Samaria? Am I required to go into the uttermost part of the earth? Right? Those are concepts. There's no real faces there, Dave.
No.
There's not a face to the uttermost part of the earth, but there is a face to the person at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. So who is my neighbor is not necessarily saying, let's just draw a circle around these particular people, or if you can, Dave, we want to live on a list. And if I can check that list off, right? The rich young ruler says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Just give me a list as long as I can check it off. But Jesus flips the script, and he doesn't talk about a Samaritan laying to the side and a Jewish man having compassion. He talks about a Jewish man laying to the side and a Samaritan having compassion. So what he's doing is he's literally giving us a visual. It's not important for you to define who your neighbor is. It's important for you to define whether or not you consider yourself their neighbor.
Yeah, and a lot of this comes because when it comes to our responsibilities, we want to be very legalistic, like you said, have a list of like that we can check and we can go down the line. But on the other hand, our liberties and our freedoms as Christians, we want to be like, oh, grace abounds and we can do whatever we want. The way that I believe we need to be looking at it is anybody that's within our sphere of influence. If I can communicate with them on social media, if I can come in contact with them during my daily drive, if I can talk to them while I'm in the line at your local coffee shop, if they are within my sphere of influence, so if you can communicate with them, you are their neighbor,
yes,
and they are your responsibility.
That is exactly what we're trying to communicate. The reason why we're saying neighbors matter is because we matter to them. No matter if they consider us as a part of what they matter, we need to see that we matter to them. So at the end of the day, Dave, my neighbor is who I make my neighbor.
Yeah.
I have to be intentional about being a neighbor. So we can define what a neighbor is in terms of the English language.
Sure.
But we know the proximity factor. Okay. So you made the great point of saying, if I'm in proximity to somebody, they're my neighbor. Why? Because I'm their neighbor. And that's how the church needs to view it. Okay, here's why that's important. If I'm speaking to a pastor, or if I'm speaking to a ministry leader in a church, if I'm speaking to a youth pastor, across the board, if I see myself as their neighbor, that affects the way that I communicate. It affects the way that I fundamentally establish the culture in my local church, how I carry myself while I'm at the coffee shop, how I communicate while I'm on social media. Social media can be one of those venues where I ruin my ability to be neighborly.
It's very easy to ruin your witness on social media.
100%. And there are enough argumentative points or outlooks on there. And there are things that bother me. And I know there are things that bother you and our listeners. I know there are things that bother you. It's hard for me. I'm just being candid on this podcast. It's hard for me. And I think this is a good subject for us to dig into for a second to prove the point. But it's very difficult for me to hear somebody that is pro-choice trying to define a child. And I'm looking right now at, your youngest. And I see her and I'm watching her blink right now and smile at what she's doing. It's hard for me to see that and allow somebody to view that as their own choice.
Yeah.
And so by my natural reaction, especially when they're not just doing it in sincerity, when they're flamboyant about, I'll do it just because. Right?
Yeah.
So I'll follow through the process. And to think that humanity might be, that we look at humanity with such, I don't know, help me out.
We're very cavalier with life.
Yes. And to say, my God, we're putting them on an altar. So yeah, believe me, that is something that I would love to jump and steamroll ahead and create a revolution about, because I'm very passionate about life. But how easy is it for me to be cavalier my own self and get on my social media, which I have a right to, Dave. It's my social media.
Absolutely.
But how many times have I performed unneighborly? You're not going to find me performing unneighborly, I promise you, because I do not use. But in terms of like social media, how many times have we allowed ourselves to be unneighborly, unwilling to look at what is half dead out there? And instead of going there, moving with compassion and getting off of our own animal, if you would, settling in, looking at where that person was, looking at the road that they're on. We're not assessing anything of that nature. Here's what we're not doing. We're not taking an individual case. I'm not agreeing with any. Abortion is 100% wrong 100% of the time.
Yeah.
There is no argument with that. 100% wrong 100% of the time.
But there are, and I absolutely agree with you, just for the clarification for everybody that's listening. However, there are rational, logical decisions that are made regarding abortion as far as like the future of the individual. It's not always like, oh, I'm going to go mess around. I'm going to do what I want to do and I'm just going to abort the child, or I'm going to do something malicious. A lot of times it comes into, and this is where we have to understand, we have to meet the person in their journey is, okay, so you've got a 15, 16-year-old girl that gets pregnant. She was out and she was doing things she wasn't supposed to be doing.
Right.
Now, we as a church, after the fact, we don't need to be throwing rocks at her and chastising her and shunning her for the rest of her life. However, it is a logical, rational thing to say, okay, if I did away with this pregnancy, she statistically has a better life opportunity, economically, socially, if she were to abort that pregnancy, and then she could go to college. Whereas if she kept that baby, again, statistically, she's probably going to be relegated to a lower income class. So it's us recognizing that. Again, abortion, wrong 100% of the time, all the time. But we have to understand where people are coming from.
And I think that's the key point here is when we look at somebody that is raised outside of the sphere of moral boundaries, And we're not looking into, and obviously we're not stating things through the lenses of Christianity right now, or, biblical rightness. We're looking at logic in terms of, what Dave just said. And if you see that person and you look at that person and they're weighing like what this is, we're not talking about somebody that is malicious about it. Now we're talking about somebody that is weighing their life. Yeah. And they haven't become attached yet to the formation of this child. They haven't, right? This right now is just something that is new. It is something that they consider that is non-formed. Although we believe life begins at conception, they haven't been taught that. So all we're saying is here today is when you see somebody on their road, okay, we can look back at this story and we can say the man was ignorant. Yeah. I mean, we can even almost go into a different word and say just downright dumb.
He was foolish.
Foolish is a great word. To travel that road alone, knowing that there were robbers and bandits. Regardless, the man's laying there half dead. So if I use the venue of social media in order to, well, I tell you what.
We could use it to blast him for all of his wrong decisions. And we could go down the list of saying, you should have known, you were asking for it, you should have been prepared. Like, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z instead of meeting the people where they are?
Yeah, there's nothing involved in this conversation that we're saying, hey, we're okay with your life decisions. Yeah. That's not what we're saying, but that's not, Jesus never insinuated that with the Samaritan story. He simply looked at the man where he was, and he got off of his beast of burden, and he walks over there, and he is moved with compassion. Yeah. And that is neighborly. Is the church being able to say, I'm not saying I agree with it, I'm not saying I endorse it, and I'm not even saying that I'm willing to tolerate it. But where do we as the church intersect with the world? Do we intersect when they politically align with us? When they socially align with us? Because we are at a very divided state right now. Yeah, we're not bringing anything, no revelations to the table. All of this is just, it's where this country's been for years and years. It's a divided nation. So do we just try to go inside of our sphere, or can we be like the Samaritan and say, I may never win them, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show them compassion, which in my observation, one of the key components of Jesus Christ was his ability to move with compassion. And it was compassion. Now, the word compassion, when you strip that word down, it can mean a concept that insinuates the womb. And there's something growing. Compassion is a very deep, deep word. It insinuates that there is something in there that is going to give birth, if you would, to action. And so when I move with compassion, it usually is not just an emotional connection to somebody. It's like, oh, I have such compassion on that person. No, you feel sorry for that person. Compassion is going to give birth. It's going to give birth to you doing something. And when the Samaritan saw him, the birth process of compassion was to get off or to get out of his vehicle, let's put it in 21st century terms, to move away from his phone when he's standing in line at a coffee shop. Get away from that vehicle, right? And look around and see and feel. We don't know the byproduct of, let's go back to abortion, the byproduct of this 16-year-old, hypothetically, that is making this decision logically. And a lot of times the parents are pushing the issue. You can't take care of this child. We're not taking care of this child. You and him are too young. You're not getting married right now. You got to finish high school. And so the pressure that she may feel, it's very easy. It's a quick action, but she's got those memories. She grows up. She does get married. She has 3 or 4 kids later in time. And all of a sudden now she thinks back to, I wonder what it would have been. I wonder if it was a little boy, would I have, is it a little girl? We don't know the lasting effects of that. Yeah. So yes, we can say, I can't stand anybody that would have abortion. I can't stand anybody that would, whatever the hot topic is right now, I'm not going to associate with it. They're targeting my children, and we get all up in arms about it. Or we can stop and we can say they're a byproduct of the nature in which they're operating in.
We have to find the people behind the issue.
So let's go right here to close this thing down. We could talk about this all day. I love this subject matter, but the Samaritan loved him sacrificially. And so when we look at sacrificially, we need to realize that when we ourselves consider ourselves as the neighbor, everyone is our neighbor. Yeah. So who is my neighbor? I'm the neighbor. I'm the neighbor of the guy in the coffee shop. I'm the neighbor of the guy in the grocery store. I'm the neighbor of the guy online. It doesn't matter if he's 3,000 miles away or if he lives in my same subdivision. I am his neighbor. So to define who is the neighbor, I am their neighbor. Yep. And I have to be neighborly. So who am I supposed to love? I'm supposed to love everyone. That's why neighbors matter, okay? So let's look at the Samaritan real quick, and let's look at some of the things that the Samaritan was, okay? And because I know that this is where we live. So when the question is who is my neighbor? Okay, we just answered that. It's everyone. I want to show our listeners here today that the Samaritan was not just somebody sitting around, okay? He didn't, he was busy just like we are. And you might think, well, it's difficult to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength enough. It's difficult to do church ministry. I'm involved in the choir. I am a student pastor. I'm a local pastor. I pastor multiple campuses. And so how in the world can I have the responsibility? Let me show you some of the points of the Samaritan, okay? First and foremost, Jesus insinuates as he journeyed, which means he was busy. We are going to be busy.
Yep.
We're going to find ourselves having to be intentional, okay? And I'm going to move quickly through here. And from him journeying, the Bible says when he saw him, we've established that he was on that road. Well, now the Samaritan is on the same road. It doesn't mean he's in the same condition, but he's sharing the same path. So you don't have to be in the condition to be able to minister to somebody that has been affected. It's like, well, I've never had an abortion, so I don't know how to minister to somebody. Well, I tell you what you can do. You can be observant of where they are. You can be compassionate. That's the third thing that he was. You can be proactive. That's the fourth thing that he was. Here's where it changes. He was giving. You can start giving. You can look at where they are. What are their needs? I may not be able to minister on the deepest level, but I can begin the process.
And giving doesn't mean that you have to solve all their problem. It just means that you have to show them that you are there and that you care, and a genuine care, not just I'm going to write you out a check and then there you go away. You have to be willing to be there for that person in whatever capacity that you can be.
I love the point you just made, because he gave oil and wine. Those were two things that he had on him. So that's what he gave. He gave what he had. And we don't have to think in terms of like, I've got to study about this. I'm telling you, the Spirit of the Lord will lead you to that individual and minister through you.
Yep.
At the point where he knows you can do. He's not going to put you in a place where you can't minister. He ministered with what he had. He was proactive. He was giving. And he takes this man to the innkeeper. So here's a journey where he and this man are together. But that's not the totality of the story. He was willing to get others involved. So he himself got involved. That's 6. Number 7, he gets others involved. Like you just said, I found out about this situation. I'm going to get my wife involved immediately. Okay. And then potentially I can get others in the church realm involved, or I can get others in the community involved, whatever. Well, we don't have to give more. We can keep going back to this solitary example, because there's a lot of examples out there where we can do, but he was willing to get others involved. We have to be willing to get others involved. It's not good enough just to bring somebody to the church.
No.
Those days of just like I've invited them to the church, those days of the church being able to care for everybody's needs, if that ever existed, it doesn't exist today. I don't know if it existed, but in my time in church ministry, in 25 years of ministry, 16 years of pastoring, you can't just drop them at the front door of the church and expect the church to be able to deal. The church is individuals. That's the way the church has always been. The success stories of the church is the individuals being able to individually get involved. Who is my neighbor? You are their neighbor. You be neighborly. So the 7th thing is get others involved. And then here's the thing, be willing to return. It was not just a one moment investment. He was willing to return. Whatever the cost is, I'm coming back. I'm coming back, and I'll be willing to pay. That's beautiful, bro. When Jesus sums it up with not just I'm taking care of him, I'm dropping him off, I'll come back. Can we get back involved in that? Don't think the church today does not celebrate first time, we call them friends. A lot of people call them guests or visitors. We don't celebrate that as highly as we celebrate second. We call that returning friends. We celebrate returning friends. It's that second opportunity for investment. And can we get back involved? How can we stay involved in somebody's life? So quick recap here, Luke 10, Samaritan story. What do we need to do to inherit eternal life? Love God, and this is the way to love him. Love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? Pride would say my neighbor is just those in proximity to me, but really the neighbor is you and whoever it is around you. So to all of our listeners here today, we covered a big subject in a very short period of time, but we want you to know that whoever is in your, as Dave said, your sphere of influence, that is your neighbor. Be compassionate and let something be birthed that is going to impact and influence somebody's life.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Bottom Half is Red. Listen, I hope you have enjoyed your time with us today and gained something of value. If you love what you heard today, please do not forget to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us. Your feedback is incredibly crucial, and we want to improve on what we're doing and to bring you the best content possible. You can find us on Facebook, look us up, Instagram, even YouTube at The Bottom Half is Red. Hey, be sure to check the episode description for any links to any resources that we have mentioned during the show. You don't want to miss out. This podcast is a production of The Church Today here in the great city of Tulsa, and the executive producer is our very own David Tandera. I hope you've had a fantastic time, and we look forward to having you with us again on our next episode of The Bottom Half is Red. We'll see you then.